Welcome everyone. We're going to get started here momentarily. Welcome to the final webinar of the SLF or Spotted Lanternfly webinar series. Today's session is called Field Demonstration of Management Solutions. This is a really exciting one because we're going to walk you through kind of how you actually do some of these applications that you've probably been hearing about in all the other webinars about Spotted Lanternfly, how you actually do this in the field. We're going to have Patrick down at his Arboretum in North Carolina to walk us through some of the key distinctions for how to do these applications. And I'll be providing you kind of an overview of some of these applications and some of the considerations for management that you'll want to take into account before you take down a pathway. And certainly in the other webinar series or sessions, you've seen maybe from a government perspective or municipality perspective, and then to a arborist or a commercial practitioner, what you should take into account. I am Chris Haugen from Rainbow Scientific Advancements, and I have Patrick Anderson here with me on this webinar to go through some of the actual field demonstration. And then we also have Matt Karst, who's going to be providing some of the back-end information, IT services. So if there's a question, he'll let us know that the question is there, and we'll take care of that at the end. But before we dive into it, a little bit of housekeeping. You'll see at the bottom, or it's on the right side, depending on how you have your panes arranged, that there's a chat, a raise hand, or a question and answer bar. We do ask that you type questions into the question and answer box using your control panel. We'll answer questions at the end of the presentation. And this is because it's hard for us to make sure that we don't miss things, especially if there's multiple chats that are going through. It's easy for us to unfortunately miss a question, and we certainly want to make sure that we're answering all of your questions. And in particular, you'll know that we saw your question or that we have acknowledged we saw your question because we'll kind of click answer now or answer at the end. So be sure to please answer or ask all of your questions in the Q&A box. This webinar is being recorded, and the link will be sent out after the webinar that you can view it at your pleasure multiple times if you miss something or you want a little more detail. This webinar is worth 1 ISA CEU. If you do not enter your ISA certification number during registration, please type that into the question and answer box. And it's always a good idea just to double check, maybe you don't remember, and we'll take care of those at the end, and we'll get those entered for you. And we do have 1 credit available each for pesticide credits for Pennsylvania, and there'll be a link to a form at the end to enter your information. And then also we have pesticide credits available for Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, and Utah. And there'll be a link that is required for you to take an assessment at the end, and we'll put that into the chat at the very end so that you can take that. And as a reminder, again, I can't stress this enough, please do type your questions into the question and answer box using your control panel. We'll make sure to answer those in the end in the order that they were received. So let's dive into today. What are we here to talk about, and what are we here to come away with? The first thing is we want to provide you with the knowledge needed to propose and implement a Spotted Lanternfly management protocol, and then know how to apply each tool properly to achieve your goals for your management plan. So we'll kind of walk you through a little bit of just a real quick review of kind of what is Spotted Lanternfly in case this does happen to be your first experience with it, and then we'll walk through kind of the life cycle and then put that into practice of what is it that we're actually doing for a management plan in each part of the season. First question, so what are Spotted Lanternfly? Well, what's important to know is that they are a plant hopper from China. So they aren't native to the United States, and they do have a somewhat limited range within the United States. It's kind of really the East Coast and then kind of the middle part of the country, but certainly right now they're just primarily in several selected states from kind of Philadelphia spreading out from there. But what's important and what we'll really talk about today and why it's important is that we recognize how they actually feed. So they're in the same order of Hemiptera as true bugs, cicadas, aphids, adelgids, whiteflies, and scale. So we call those the piercing and sucking insects. And this is really important for how we're going to actually assign a management plan to them and what our expectations are as far as efficacy and control. And really also then making sure that we complete our applications in a manner that's going to provide the highest levels of control for those as well. And they are also just a really pretty looking insect as well. But what kind of damage do they do? It varies widely. A big concern is certainly in orchards and fruit crops because they can actually so dramatically overwhelm the crop and then reduce the photosynthetic capability and also just the energy possibility for the plant as well. For most ornamental plant landscapes, what we're seeing primarily, you're not going to be necessarily worried about fruit quality or fruit or the initial end harvest quality or quantity. We're looking at more of some of the other aspects of what unfortunately comes from spotted lanternfly, because they aren't typically going to actually outright kill a plant. They can certainly cause a lot of unsightliness. As we'll see here, they are a large insect, so homeowners and property landscape managers are definitely going to notice them. What we're primarily seeing from people and hearing from our customers and clients is that it's the oozing wounds that are caused by them, so you'll see a lot of sap flow that comes out of it. You'll see sooty mold that is really from the honeydew that is raining down on the plant material below, is a perfect growing medium for the fungus of sooty mold. And then you can also have what unfortunately occurs in some of the larger plant material. You'll leave the plants subjected to ambrosia beetles, which are already stressed by spotted lanternfly. They come in as kind of a secondary insect that's attacking preferentially those stressed plants, and those can certainly cause tree death and plant dieback as well. But then you'll probably see what's the impact on properties. Sooty mold, as I mentioned before, that is not just limited to plant material, but also decks, vehicles, plant or picnic tables, places where people like to congregate and spend time. And then you can also see here, these are quite large and they do almost kind of have like a sort of a swarm effect, and they can overwhelm. Imagine if these were all at the front door of your home for a client, they can be quite offensive and just gross. So that's a big part of it. And then also because they do have a amount of honeydew, they can actually attract stinging insects as well, like wasps or bees. So those can be another part of why we want to make sure that we're managing these populations so that we're not getting some of those secondary issues coming in as well. What does it actually feed on? So it prefers Elianthus, so tree of heaven. It's the first choice for the adults to feed on, but certainly, as I'll show next, they do have a very wide host range. And the latest research is showing that it does not require, a tree of heaven is not required for spotted lanternfly to complete its life cycle. It is able to complete it on other plant species as well. So it does have a slightly expanded range, but definitely do consider removal of spotted lanternfly as a part of your management strategy. We're probably not going to go through how to do that. Certainly, we're probably in this context not the best experts for how to use a chainsaw. But it is a definite part of the management strategy. As I mentioned, it's host plants. So on the left side, you have the nymph stage, and it really prefers roses, grapes, weeds, sumac, and then tree of heaven, and a few other ornamental plants. But then as we look at the host plants for the adults, you'll see a lot of them that are going to be very common to our homeowner customers or our landscape customers. Tree of heaven, black walnut, birch, willow, silver maple, grape, black locust, peaches, cherries, oaks, especially in pine. Those are plant species that are very common that we're going to see and encounter, where we may need to be looking at some of our systemic applications to reduce the prevalence of the adults as well. A real quick overview of the life cycle, and then I'll kind of tie this into what are we doing from a management strategy. Really, all aspects of this life cycle are going to be quite visible. It's maybe a good thing for us that we can readily see this pest. The eggs are going to look like, quite honestly, to me, it looks like snot. It's going to look like it's just an egg mass of snot on a plant, and it'll be maybe on the bark tissue. One strategy is to just scrape it to dispose of those eggs. And this is going to be, its overwintering stage. So at this point, it's still in its egg stage. You might, in the next couple of weeks, start to see that first instar developing and really notice that growing degree date. You'll see it starts at about 240. that is going to be really your starting point of when you should be starting to scout and look for those. And you can certainly inspect some of the egg masses to see whether they've emerged from that first instar. And it begins with quince or saucer magnolia. Those are a common one, especially in the East Coast for when they're blooming. You can probably be pretty certain that those first instars are going to be emerging. And then it'll progress into the second, and then the third, and then the fourth, and then really take note of when that adult. So that's kind of another life stage that we're really going to be focusing our application stages on, or our management strategies on. And those are going to occur in July at about almost 1,700 growing degree days. And this can occur really as long as the weather allows for it and it's fairly warm. So we've seen adults feeding as late as December. So keep that in mind, especially as you're looking at some of these materials that may have a shorter residual. So just keep that in mind for later as we get to that. So I mentioned we were going to be talking about kind of overlaying some of the life cycle. So as we talked about with the first through the third instar and kind of transitioning into the fourth, you'll see the first and the third instar, they're going to feed primarily on the herbaceous plants, and they're going to feed on the leaves and the stems. Once we get into that fourth, they're going to start moving on to the more hardy, woody plant tissue. And once they get really into that adult stage, that's where we're going to see a lot of that honeydew raining on plant material, because they're going to be feeding on that phloem tissue. And that's where they're inserting that stylet from their piercing and sucking mouth part. And then you're going to have all the excess flowing through them, just as if you were part of our scale webinars. We talked about soft scales. Very similar how they act like that. So keep that in mind. So then if we're going to look overlaying now, how are we going to be actually managing this? Aside from some of the more the environmental and the physical barriers, if you're looking at the physical, we can always scrape eggs, if they're present. And then there's certainly a possibility of doing some of the sticky band traps on select plants. Or if it's environmental, you can start looking at removing tree of heaven or other susceptible species if it's appropriate. But then as we hone in on certainly the chemistry or the chemical application side of it, there's really three kind of periods where we're going to be looking at. There's the chemical foliar or cover spray, which then can lead into a trunk and limb cover spray. Because think about, as we just talked about, with what they're feeding on. If you're looking at earlier in the season, you're probably going to be focused on more of those herbaceous plants. Once we get into the fourth instar in adults, we want to be targeting our applications to where they're going to be feeding. And when we're looking at the systemic applications, we've got Transtect as a bark spray, and then a Transtect tree injection option as well. So as I mentioned, there's kind of the 5 components. There's tree removal. We can try to reduce by egg scraping and tree banding. And then we get into the insecticide options of foliar sprays and systemic treatments. And we're going to have Patrick demonstrate a couple of these with the foliar sprays and then the 2 systemic treatments as well. So the first one we're going to talk about, and how this will work is I'll kind of walk over the general overview of the foliar application, what you're looking for and why you might do it, some of the considerations, and then I'll push it over to Patrick and he's going to actually do a demo for us so we can actually see it in action. So we're looking at, there's 2 bifenthrins that we would recommend. There's a Bifen XTS, which is a higher chemistry active percentage. You'd mix at a 12.8 ounce rate per 100 gallons, or Upstart Gold at 21.7 ounces per 100 gallons. And what's important to note is that these are contact insecticides, and they'll have about a 3 to 4 week residual. But what's really important is that it is going to require contact with the insect. So if you're doing, as with anything with foliar sprays, if you don't hit the target point where they're actually feeding or hitting the actual insect itself, it's not going to provide you the control that you're looking for and for your customers. But it is going to control both the nymphs and the adults, and really look at when you're on properties, targeting your shrubs early into the season to control those younger instars in the nymph stage. And it does provide certainly a quick knockdown of adults. If you're later into the growing season and a client calls you out and they're, freaking out about, I've got all these adults, what do I do? A quick knockdown spray may be a wise option, and to consider in case you may, just want to show that you're doing something today. But then you'd want to tailor an add-on as well as systemic option to really keep that population down, because they can certainly come in from the neighbors and across the street and so on and so forth. We are going to want to be careful of, certainly, as with any insecticide spray, we want to be very sensitive to pollinator plants, any pollinator activity. And then certainly we want to make sure that if we're spraying, we have to deal with the wind issues, the rain issues, and all the whole host of, people wondering what you're spraying, its toxicity, and so on and so forth. So I'll kick it over to Patrick now, and he's going to go through a foliar spray application demonstration. Patrick, to you.
Depending upon your client's expectations, you might want to do preventative treatments for nymphs early on in the season. One of their favorite host plants is rose. So you want to use a product like Penetrant that is a contact insecticide. It has about a 2-week residual, maybe a little bit more, and because it's a contact, you want to make sure you get full coverage of the plant. Again, it kills on contact, but it also will continue to repel these pests for up to 2 weeks. You want to spray before the flowers are blooming because Penetrant will kill pollinators. That being said, we'll also get some of your early season pests like aphids as well as sawflies. You might induce spider mite outbreaks though with using Penetrant. If you're worried about spider mite outbreaks, you might need to come back in a few weeks to treat with something like abamectin or bifenazate. So with that, I'm just going to treat this rose. I'm going to turn on my pressure a little bit. I'm going to stand back. I'm going to make sure I get good coverage. I'm going to come around to the other side. And with that, our treatment is complete.
Thanks, Patrick. To bring it back, and just as we close out kind of the Penetrant spray considerations, we do want to balance out that we're making sure we're not hitting all the beneficial insects, because it certainly can have an unintended consequence of, maybe you have other insecticide programs going on as well for other pests. This may be a good timing for maybe scale insects if crawlers are lining up to it. And then there is certainly the public perception and then environmental concerns. You certainly don't want to be hitting pollinators or applying to plants that are commonly foraged for pollinators. And then certainly as we look at kind of, there is a public concern around the number of insecticides. So that is a concern to make sure that you're allowing and being accountable for. Now, as we look at kind of our systemic control methods, we have really 2 flavors of that to kind of deal with. There's Transtect or Transtect infusible, and these are a great choice for using as a systemic because it gives you very quick control. If you're looking at a bark spray, you're looking at a few days, and if you're looking at a trunk injection, even shorter than that. It is the best choice for tree treatments because we can bark spray it or tree inject or put it in as a tree injection or a soil treatment if necessary as well. But it does give us a long residual to allow us to have, into that later parts of the growing season where the adults might still be feeding. If we look at Transtect as a bark spray, it's packaged as a 70% Dinotefuran in a water-soluble packet, 20 water-soluble packets per unit. And you'll notice that this rate is slightly different than many, maybe perhaps of your scale treatments. We do recommend that you use 12 WSPs per fluid gallon with 2.5 ounces of scrimmage, which is a pentra or a bark penetrant per gallon. And this is helpful because it adds to the levels of control and it provides faster knockdown. You'll see uptake within about 2 to 5 days, and you'll have a 4-month residual with this insecticide treatment. And apply treatment in July to control the 4th instars into the adults. I wouldn't recommend moving this treatment up into June or May. While it may be tempting just because you're seeing some of the earlier instars out, they're probably not as likely to be feeding on these larger trees as they would be later on into life. And we do be aware that we do have a 24C label for 3 times the pounds per acre limit on Tree of Heaven as well. So if you have a property that has a lot of Tree of Heaven, this can be a really nice tool to really reduce the insecticide population of a lot of the preferred plant material. And there is a 24C in New York that allows for use on Tree of Heaven to control spotted lanternfly as well. So Patrick, I'll push it over to you to do a bark spray demonstration.
So doing a lower systemic bark spray is a relatively new method, and it's a method that's beginning to catch on. So generally speaking, we have a few products that work very well as a lower systemic bark spray. One of the most common ones that we use is Dinotefuran. So as we know, Dinotefuran affects a whole host range of piercing and sucking insects. We also know Dinotefuran as a systemic moves very quickly in the tree, and that would hold true for lower systemic bark sprays as well as soil applications. So with Dinotefuran as a lower systemic bark spray, we know that it is moving up into the tree fairly quickly. So between 7 and 14 days, we should have concentrations build up into the canopy to where we're beginning to affect pests. So with lower systemic bark spray, we can do this very fast. And again, very low labor and easy equipment. So doing a lower systemic bark spray, we're just using a standard pump up backpack sprayer. And what we're doing is we're spraying the base of the tree from about 5 feet on the trunk down to the root flare, covering the entire circumference. What we want to do with Dinotefuran is we want to apply 1.5 to 2 ounces per inch diameter to, again, the lower portion of the trunk, 5 feet down, coating the root flares, getting the full circumference. Easy enough to do. There are a few tips and tricks though to doing this so that you get enough active ingredient into the plant while not wasting it. There's also some things we need to think about from a label perspective that will help us out. So the first thing we want to do is we want to make sure that we are getting enough active ingredient onto the tree, but we also don't want to overdo it. Again, if we overdo it, we could be maybe affecting our pounds per square acre limit on our property. We could also have some unintended consequences with getting too much product into the tree. Likewise, we don't want to underdo it. So what we want to do is we want to calibrate our equipment so that we know we're getting at least 1.5 to 2 ounces of solution per inch diameter onto this tree. So the first kind of tip to trick to calibration is installing one of these control flow valves onto your pump up backpack sprayer. And so your label is going to talk about applying this application at a low PSI. And so what this here is, this is a 14 PSI control flow valve. What control flow valves do is they make it so that you can't spray at any higher PSI than 14 PSI in this case with this control flow valve. So you can see on this particular piece of equipment, I have a nice little pressure gauge. So right now you can see I'm pressurized to about 30 PSI. When I squeeze the trigger here, this can only come out at 15 PSI, or excuse me, 14 PSI. This is a 14 PSI control flow valve. So that way I know consistently how much is coming out of the tip because it can only spray out at 14 PSI. Now, likewise, the nice thing about this is that once it drops below 14 PSI, because this is again a 14 PSI control flow valve, it will stop spraying altogether. So that way I know exactly how much is coming out of the hose. I know exactly what pressure is coming out of the hose. I don't have to worry about over-pressuring or under-pressurizing the system. So that is key to install your control flow valve so you can control the pressure coming out. The next part is we need to calibrate the time it takes for our solution to come out. So again, because we want to apply between 1.5 to 2 ounces of solution per inch diameter, we need to know what that actually means coming out of the hose. So if I have my control flow valve, I know the pressure that it's coming out at. The next thing would be to do a count. So to count how long it takes me to get to, a predetermined amount. So what I'm calibrating here for is I want to get at least 2 ounces of solution per a certain count. So we can do this a couple different ways. We can do it the old-fashioned way where we simply just count. So let's say we start with 1, 2, 3, and I can look to see where I'm at with 1, 2, 3. And at 1, 2, 3, I'm right at 2 ounces. So if I count 1, 2, 3, I'm going to get the solution out on the tree per inch that I want. Now, of course, the issue with doing that count method is that 1, 2, 3 can change throughout the day, right? The beginning of the day, you're counting dead on. 1, 2, 3. Towards lunchtime, you're getting a little slow, and your 1, 2, 3 becomes 1, 2, 3. And then at the end of the day, when you want to get done, your 1, 2, 3 becomes 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, right? So, a neat little trick that I learned from a colleague of mine was to use a metronome app that you can download onto your phone. So this by no means is a endorsement of this particular app here, but I use an app called Sound Corset that you can find again on your Google Play or your App Store, whatever it is. And with this app, it has a metronome function, and all I did was I determined what beat constituted 2 ounces. So in this case here, I can hit it, and you can hear every beat is going to be 2 ounces. So instead of having to worry about counting 1, 2, 3, I just count beats. So with this tree, like many other of our applications, what we're doing here, our systemic applications, is that the diameter of the tree, of course, is going to dictate how much product we need to use, and then the solution that we're going to need. So again, this is a 22-inch tree. I would then cross-reference my label to see how much I need to mix for 22 inches. And again, we're going to mix it in a solution that we're applying about, again, 2 ounces to 1.5 ounces of solution per diameter, getting that full coverage around the bark. And now doing this is kind of, there's a little bit of an art to doing lower bark sprays. So I would encourage you, before you go out and start doing these, to kind of practice a little bit. Practice getting that full coverage around the base of the tree. So you probably want to start with some water. So calibrate your equipment. You want to, use some water and practice getting full coverage around the base of the tree there. And so I'm just going to move this out of our way. So again, I've done the calibration using my app, so I know that every beat is 2 ounces of solution. This is a 22-ounce tree, or excuse me, a 22-inch tree, so we'll use 22 ounces, or excuse me, 44 ounces, right? Something else to consider is the use of a bark penetrant. So using a bark penetrant can only help your solution. A lot of data shows that you may or may not need to use bark penetrants, but we still recommend using bark penetrants because it's only going to improve your solution, only help it to get through the lenticels in the bark up into the tree. Now, one important note is that if you're going to use a bark penetrant at the labeled rates, the label on those bark penetrants are going to say that you need to wear some kind of face protection like a face shield. And so you're going to want, if you use a bark penetrant, you're going to have to make sure that you have a face shield down as per the label. Another little tip that for doing this application is a lot of these backpack sprayers come with a pre-installed hollow fan or a hollow cone spray nozzle, which is just fine. But what I like to do for these lower bark spray applications is I actually like to install a flat fan nozzle. And again, a flat fan kind of sprays in that one dimension, and that allows us to kind of get a directed flow right at the tree, so we don't have a lot of drift going on and off, and also we don't have to kind of adjust our fan, because if we adjust our fan, we're going to mess up our calibration. So use a flat fan nozzle because it makes it easier to get it on the bark of the tree. Also doesn't mess up our calibration. If you're going to be using a bark penetrant, which we do recommend, though it's not required for all applications, you'll need to wear a face shield. So I'm going to just go ahead and treat this tree. Again, we have a 22-inch tree. So I'll be applying 44 ounces of total solution. That's going to be, again, 2 ounces per inch diameter. I'm going to spray from 5 feet down, coating the roof layer, getting the full circumference. And so you probably can't hear my metronome any longer, but I have my metronome set up here so I can hear it going. And so here we go. So I applied our solution. I was listening to my metronome. It counted 22 beats for me, so I knew I put out what I needed to put out. And notice what I did here is I kind of took this in 3 different levels. I started here at the top. I did a lap around. I moved down a little bit to a lower level. I did a lap around, and then finally in my last lap I made sure that I got down there on those root flares. So again, it takes a little bit of practice. If you're going to do this method, encourage to practice with water first. Again, get your calibration, use your control flow valve, and highly recommend using a metronome app. So that way you can just count beats instead of having to count in your head. Makes it very easy, very effective, and very fast. So personally speaking, we've been out on properties, we've treated over 40 trees in an hour using this method.
Thanks, Patrick. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the next step or option, which would be a Transtect infusible injection. And this would be a root flare trunk injection as a micro injection. This is a 22.5% Dinotefuran, which is packaged in a 1 pint container. And the rates, and this is why it's really attractive, is the rates are exceptionally low. 1 milliliter per diameter at breast height gives you very, very high levels of control. And this is really effective or helpful for trees or properties where it's near water or maybe where trunk sprays are not possible. It's an option for staying within the pounds per acre limits of other treatments because it does not have a pounds per acre restriction on it. So that you can reserve some of those other restrictions for pounds per acre for perhaps maybe other pests that are on the property like scale insects. And it does also have a 24C in New York. So Patrick, I'll push it over to you to do a little bit of a tree injection demonstration.
So trunk injection is a great method, a great tool in the toolbox to apply products directly into the tree to affect our pests. So the question always comes up of, why do trunk injection when we have such great application methods for piercing and sucking insects like soil applications or lower systemic bark sprays? And that is a great question, and there's some good reasons for it. So one good reason for a trunk injection is that when we direct a product directly into the tree, there's no question of where it's going and how it's getting there. The other reason, of course, might be speed and distribution. So we see that with trunk injected products, the speed of uptake is much faster. So, thinking of things like imidacloprid. With imidacloprid, when we apply that as a soil application, it can take 30 to 120 days for it to get up into the canopy of the tree to be effective. Whereas when we do a trunk injection, it is much faster. We're talking about weeks instead of months. So that's another advantage, is speed up there. And then also, again, distribution-wise, because as long as we're getting even distribution of our injection sites along the base of the tree, we don't have to worry about movement in the soil. So those are some good reasons for doing trunk injections. Some other reasons would be to conserve just beneficial and benign insects. Because again, we're putting the product right into the tree. It's not going into the environment at all, right into the tree. We have less chance of introducing that product to some of our, our good insects or, our insects that really aren't hurting anything at all. A best management practice is going to be not to apply systemics around flowering plants or plants that attract pollinators. So in this case of this tree here, we can see we have some flowering plants right here. So this here is a type of flowering clover, an ornamental clover. Over here behind me, we also have, bear with me, we have some Lenten rose, which of course can flower. And so these are in very close proximity to the base of this tree, as you can see. So if we did a soil application, there's a chance that, we might, some of that application, some of that product might make its way into these flowering plants, and then it could affect our pollinators. So the method here, again, is we're going to measure the diameter of the tree at 4.5 feet from the ground. And then, of course, that will dictate our dose. So I mentioned with Dinotefuran, in some cases, we're treating as low as 1 milliliter per inch diameter. So, if we had, in the case of, a 10-inch tree, we'd only be applying 10 mils to the base of that tree, or to the root flares of that tree. The next part of that then also talks about how many injection sites we want to do. And so we found that what we want to do with these systemic products that we mentioned, we want to do an injection site for every other inch of diameter. So if we're dealing with a 10-inch diameter tree, which in, of course, this tree here is larger than that, but if we're doing a 10-inch diameter tree, we would do 5 injection sites around the base of the tree. And really what we mean when we say trunk injection, we mean concentration on the root flares. So you want to get down as low on that root flare as possible. So what we're going to do here is we're going to use a low volume piece of plugless equipment in this case. So in this case here, we're using a piece of equipment where all you're using is hand power to squeeze it in. So, and that's the nice thing about doing things like Dinotefuran and imidacloprid is that you get, you can use very low volume, so you don't need expensive or complicated equipment. You can use this low volume, easy to use equipment to do your application. And again, we're just doing concentrate. So what I would do is I'd put the concentrate into my bottle. Here I have my nifty bag and bottle here. So I just put the concentrate there into my bottle. I'd be set to go for the day. I'd pour that whole thing in there. And then I would make sure that I am calibrated so I can adjust my calibration on this particular gun. I'd make sure I'm calibrated so I'm only putting in the desired amount. And so let's say I'm doing Dinotefuran here. And so as I mentioned, we would be doing something as little as 1 milliliter per inch of diameter in this case. So if we're doing 1 milliliter per inch of diameter, then we're doing an injection site for every other inch of diameter. So again, if we had a 10-inch tree, we were doing 5 injection sites evenly distributed along the root flares. So we would avoid any of these indentations. We'd avoid any of these sinuses. We would just get even distribution with concentration on the root flare. So again, if we had a 10-inch tree, we would be doing 5 injection sites. And so if we were doing 1 milliliter per inch diameter, that would be 2 milliliters per injection site. So I want to make sure that my equipment, whatever it may be, is calibrated so that I'm just doing 2 milliliters per injection site. So again, things to consider here is we want to use a 18-volt drill at least. We want to make sure we have a nice powerful drill so again, we're not getting our bit bogged down. We want to make sure that our drill bit is sharp. As soon as we suspect that our drill bit is dulling out, we just want to change it. We don't want to keep one of these bits around. We want to make sure they're sharp. And you know they're sharp because as you're drilling, they're going to pull out big pigtails of wood. We call them pigtails. Once it starts to dull out, we're not going to see those pigtails anymore. And so we'll start seeing more of a finer dust. And that's when we know it's time to change out our bit. So again, if I'm looking at here, looking at even distribution on the root flares, I'm going to clear out my root flare here. I'm going to do my drilling so that I am perpendicular to the vascular system because I want to cut right into that vascular system. I'm going to do a quick in and out motion. I don't want to linger in that hole. So I'll start, I'll get lined up. Quick in, quick out. And so I'm only doing, for this specific piece of equipment, I'm only drilling 3/4 of an inch to 1 inch past the bark into the vascular system. And so that's exactly what I want to do. A nice little clean hole here. And now I'm simply going to install my T. And again, with this piece of equipment, there's no need to have a hammer or chisel or anything. There's no need to have to pound this in. We're simply going to apply the T. We're going to give ourselves a little right-hand turn. We're going to feel it kind of bite inside the wood. And then I'm simply just going to put in 2 milliliters of product. So we're going to do 1, 2, just like that, into the tree. I'm going to remove my T. My application is done. So I would do this again. This was a 10-inch tree. I would do that 5 more times. Very fast, very effective.
Well, thank you, Patrick. To kind of bring it back home, to round this out, we want to bring in, this is a toolbox approach, and there's a few options that are going to be fitting, and you need to consider them all. If you have a client that has a high tolerance, or maybe they're not as affected by the presence of insects or the accumulation of sticky honeydew, maybe it's in the back 40, maybe you just focus on protecting those high value trees that are right around the house. Maybe they're a medium tolerance, so the property has trees or areas that require protection, but the client doesn't want or need every susceptible tree in every area treated. Well, maybe it's a conversation of, which ones are the most important, where do they spend the most time, and then tailor your application to that. If they have a low tolerance, the client is going to likely be highly adverse to seeing masses of insects and or the stickiness of honeydew. It's unacceptable around the property. This is where you might have to roll every kind of strategy into it, where maybe you're doing some scraping, you're doing some foliar sprays early in the spring on some of the shrub plants to reduce populations of the early instars, and then you're also protecting all the high-value plant material with maybe a basal bark spray with Transtect, or in some cases a trunk injection of Transtect infusible. You're going to have to kind of look at all of these, and certainly if you have questions and you're looking at maybe getting some support of, well, what should I be doing on this property? How would you look at it? Please do reach out to us and reach out to your territory manager or our tech support staff, and we'll be more than happy to walk you through that and maybe provide you some guidance and coaching. And another part to consider is when you're building this, the treatment option. Maybe it's the timing of year, the plant material that's available, and the site restrictions. Those are going to all kind of influence what application method and what tools are available to them. And then certainly really get clear from the client, as I mentioned, kind of what their tolerance level. What are their expectations? Certainly, you want to make sure you're setting the expectations that there likely will be some spotted lanternfly that they see. We can't create a force field around the property, but find out what are the most important parts of their property. Maybe it's the pool, the deck space, or the patio, or driveways and sidewalks, playgrounds. Certainly if they have young children, they're not going to want to have these sticky egg masses on the slide. So just kind of have an open conversation and create a dialogue with them. And then certainly I do want to make a plug for, we have a really wonderful spotted lanternfly management guide, which is going to walk you through in greater depth everything I covered just now, but it's also going to provide some additional features and coaching on some of the application methods. As a reminder, we do have the state pesticide applicator credits for Pennsylvania. Have your state pesticide applicator license number ready, and then click on the link that'll be in the chat right now, fill out that form, and we'll submit it for you, and then get you your credits. For you out in the West Coast, certainly spotted lanternfly is not there. We're so glad that you came, but for Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, and Utah, there'll be in the chat a link that'll take you to a short little assessment. You do have to complete that within 5 minutes as part of the state pesticide regulations. And then we'll submit your information to your state governing agency, and we'll provide you with a certificate of attendance as well. So if you're in Pennsylvania, go to the Pennsylvania link. Everybody else, Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, Utah, go to that one. Perfect. Now, we'll finish up with any questions.